There's been a lot of attention recently on slaughterhouses and how some have become the centre of COVID outbreaks. For example, this meat processing plant in Germany, more than 1,300 positive tests have been linked to the factory and 7,000 employees and their families are now in quarantine. In fact, that outbreak's so large that on its own it's helped to push up Germany's R number. That's the measure of how fast the virus is spreading. Scientists want to see that R number under 1. In Germany, it's risen to 2.8. Now, this plant's in northwest Germany. Its management says the outbreak may have begun when workers travelled to Eastern Europe at the end of Germany's lockdown. Maybe, but focus has shifted to the working conditions at the plant. The owner is a German billionaire and he held a press conference over the weekend.
As a businessman and someone who puts people first, I can only offer my complete apologies because we are the cause of this issue and carry full responsibility, me as a businessman and the company as a whole.
Now, more broadly, Germany's been praised for its handling of this pandemic. In the last few weeks, though, people have been adjusting to the easing of lockdown rules, and some are calling this moment, this particular outbreak, a psychological blow. The Guardian article you can see here describes a level of fury in the affected region. And there are, of course, fears in Germany, as we've seen elsewhere, of a second wave of infections. Here's Damon McGuinness in Berlin.
For these individuals involved in these outbreaks, it's incredibly serious. However, we've got a few caveats with this quite drastically rising R number. One of them is that because the infection rates in Germany overall are pretty low, any small jump in the numbers does lead to a quite rapid rise in that R factor. The other thing is that what we're seeing with these localised outbreaks is that so far the authorities have acted pretty effectively and there's no sign that they've spread to the wider community. So throughout Germany as a whole, infection rates are pretty low, and 140 local authorities, for example, say they've not seen any new infections for the past 7 days. So what we're seeing so far in Germany, despite these quite concerning individual localised outbreaks, there's no sign of a second wave nationwide as yet, but certainly the individual incidents are extremely worrying.
Now, this focus on meat processing plants is not isolated to Germany at all. Outbreaks have forced plants to shut in other parts of Europe, in the Americas, in Australia. Here in the UK, for example, 3 sites were closed last week after clusters of infection were discovered. 150 people tested positive at a bacon plant in Cleckheaton. There have been further outbreaks at a food plant in Wrexham and elsewhere in Wales at the Two Sisters plant in Anglesey, which is the UK's biggest chicken plant. All 560 workers are now self-isolating. Thomas Morgan's in Cardiff.
There are 7 health boards across Wales, and where this incident took place on that health board, it was actually an area where there had been one of the lowest numbers of coronavirus during the outbreak across Wales. What has happened was, well, this began last week, actually, around last Tuesday, when 1 or 2 of the workers started to come down with coronavirus symptoms. By the end of last week, a number more had come down with symptoms and has tested positive. And then it was decided to shut down the plant. We now know that there are over 150 workers that have been tested positive for coronavirus, and the company have closed down the plant entirely now, and everyone that works there is self-isolating. Now, what the Welsh government have said is that because they want to limit the spread of the virus and make sure that nobody else catches it, other than the people whose families they live with, they are considering locking down the island and making sure that nothing can come in or out to make sure that virus doesn't spread. Now, schools in Wales were due to reopen a week today, but we now understand that that won't be happening because they don't want the virus to spread anymore. Now, of course, this plant is a plant that manufactures and processes chicken for a number of high street and fast food chains across Britain. But the Food Standards Agency has said that there is no risk that the virus can be passed on by the food that comes out of the plant. So there's no danger to anyone else outside of the workforce.
Now, the focus on meat processing plants is not a huge surprise. Conditions inside slaughterhouses make them ideal breeding grounds for COVID-19. There are a number of reasons for that. The US agency, the CDC, has documented some of them. It describes cramped conditions along processing lines, plus long hours in close proximity to workers, and then the layout of the factory floor as all barriers to social distancing. It adds that the pace of work and the physical demands make it difficult to always wear face coverings. Other research has been carried out looking into the issue of noise. Research was conducted by a team in London. It looks at how the presence of loud noise can bring workers physically closer sometimes. Socioeconomic factors are also well documented. We know, for example, that in Europe and in the US, the meat industry relies on cheap migrant labour. Many people travel to work by bus or in shared cars, making it easier for the disease to spread. Communication also presents a challenge. The CDC points out that in one factory in the US, 40 different languages are spoken. We also saw this FT article focusing on Germany. It says working up to 60 hours a week, the migrants live 7 to 8 per accommodation provided by subcontracting agencies. So again, conditions for the disease to spread. And there's one other important factor, the cold environments in these plants. Here's one virologist on that.
So the cold temperature doesn't help because we know that humidity and heat helps destroy the virus. So that means that the virus will be on surfaces for longer, which therefore increases the potential for transmission. But really, when it looks at the epidemiological factors that are most involved in transmission, it's density of people. So it really is the number of people in one place for an extended period of time.
Now, this issue is acute in the US. Nearly 200 meatpacking plants have reported outbreaks. For example, in Indiana, 900 employees at a pork factory caught the virus. More than 800 were infected at another facility in South Dakota. 8 people died in Greeley, Colorado. And here's another statistic. According to the Food and Environment Reporting Network, 20,000 meatpacking workers in the US have fallen ill with COVID-19. All of that applies pressure on food supplies. In April, Donald Trump used presidential powers to force some meat processing factories to stay open. He cited national security reasons. So is the food supply chain a valid concern now? Here's Anthony Zerkert in Washington.
It's not only, with these facilities shutting down because of outbreaks with them, but when they're reopening again, the process has to be changed to ensure workers' safety. So the production rate declines, and that causes backlogs in the supply chain all the way to, from the people who are producing the pork, raising the hogs and beef, to the grocery stores in the neighborhood. So when you get disruptions in the supply chain, 2 things happen. One, you get less of the supplies, so there aren't as many pieces of meat on the shelves in stores, and also prices gone up. And you've seen both those things happen in the U.S. over the past couple months. Although I will say recently it seems like the chain has been restored somewhat, so the supply at least has increased, if not the prices going down.
And does the meat processing industry in the US accept that it has a particular issue with reference to COVID?
Oh, I think they do acknowledge that there is a threat to workers' safety. You see each company handled it a little bit differently, and of course, the Trump administration, as you mentioned, in April came in with that order under the Defense Production Act saying that this was critical infrastructure and essentially prevented states and localities from imposing additional requirements on these meat production facilities beyond what was recommended by the federal government. If you talk to meatpacking producers, they say they're doing everything they have to. They're doing everything that's necessary to protect this health and safety of their workers, although there are worker unions and advocacy groups that are saying that there's still not enough, that people are still getting sick, that they're being forced to get back to work or forego a paycheck, and that they are essentially sacrificing their health in order to ensure their financial security.